Welcome back. We are now starting Unit 3, which is going to be all about nutrition. So I'll write that here at the top. This is Unit 3, and we're going to learn everything we need to know about nutrition. So today's aim, which is not on my PowerPoint, but is on your paper, is how does the process of digestion maintain homeostasis? Okay. Now, I'm not going to tell you what is digestion yet, because hopefully we'll be able to figure that out by the end of today's lesson. But we should know what homeostasis is. Remember, that is a stable internal environment. So by the end of today's lesson, you should be able to answer this aim. So now you're due now. The first thing I want you guys to do is you're going to organize the words from least to most complex. So the words you're going to use are right here. Take about 1 minute and organize those structures in order from least complex, so smallest, to the most complex or the largest. And press play on this video and you're ready to go over it. So in these, I can't speak English. In these structures, the least complex or the smallest structure is going to be organelle. Remember, we find those inside cells. Okay, cells make up tissues, tissues make up organs, and then finally organs make up organ systems, which build up to organisms. So if we were to add the word organ system in here, we would place it in between organ and organism, which is our final word right there. All right, so hopefully you got those correct, because now we're moving on. So the first thing I want to ask you is, what is digestion? So before we go over this, I want you to just take a minute and write down your own definition of what do you think digestion is? Okay. So before our bodies can use the food that we eat, it must be first digested. But what does that actually mean? So digestion is going to be the breakdown of large complex molecules of food into small, simpler molecules. So when we talk about digestion, we're just talking about breaking things down. And we're going to be taking larger molecules and breaking them down into smaller ones. So I might have showed you a picture of what this looks like when we talked about carbohydrates, right? We said that our body takes those long chains of carbohydrates and breaks them down or digests them into smaller, simple sugars. So our body is breaking down those complex, larger molecules into smaller, simpler ones. Okay, so this is done by two different ways. It's done by mechanical and chemical digestion. Now, I'm not going to give you actual definitions of what that is just yet, because I think we're going to be able to figure it out together. So when you think of the word mechanical, you might think of like a mechanic, right? And what do mechanics do? Well, they work with their hands, they're working with machinery, they're doing manual labor, right? And that's a lot of the same things that we'll be talking about with mechanical digestion. It has to do with machinery and manual labor inside our body. So we'll figure out what some examples of that are pretty shortly. The second type of digestion is known as chemical digestion. Now, when we hear the word chemical, it's usually followed by a reaction, right? Chemical reactions. And we also know that those chemical reactions are controlled by enzymes. So be thinking about what that means in terms of digestion. So before we go over this, I want to give you two questions to see if you can figure out what mechanical and chemical digestion are. So the first question here is, teeth chewing food into smaller digestible pieces is known as what? And question number 2 is, enzymes and acidic juices in the stomach, which break proteins down into smaller molecules, is known as what? So go ahead and write down your two guesses for those answers, and then we'll go over them together. All right, so the first one, teeth chewing food, right? When you are gnawing on, the first thing that came to mind was a steak. If you're chewing on a steak, you're breaking down those food into smaller molecules. That's going to be mechanical digestion, right? So if your teeth are chewing or gnawing down on that food, that is manual labor, right? That is mechanical digestion. You are actively chewing and actively breaking that food down. Your teeth grinding is what's breaking that food apart. So you are doing the manual labor there. Now, number 2, we see the word enzymes, which we know is usually talking about chemical reactions. Okay, so enzymes and acidic juices in the stomach, which break proteins down into smaller molecules, is known as what? So because we're dealing with enzymes, because we're dealing with stomach acid here, we're going to be talking about chemical digestion, because those are chemical reactions that are done to break down those molecules. You don't have to think about that happening. Your body just does that on its own. Those enzymes are what's controlling the rate of those chemical reactions inside your stomach that are actively breaking down those molecules. So once again, number 1 was mechanical, number 2 was chemical. All right, now when we're talking about digestion, it's important to remember that we can't forget about these biomolecules that we just talked about in our previous unit. These are going to come up a lot, so we need to be able to take what we've learned in previous units and bring it forward into our current one. So when we talk about these complex biomolecules, these are going to be digested or broken down into their building blocks. So remember, we've talked about the building blocks of different biomolecules. Those are going to come back up. So complex molecules like proteins are going to be digested into their building blocks, which is, I hope you got amino acids, right? So next up, carbohydrates, starches are going to be digested or broken down into their building blocks, which are simple sugars. And finally, lipids are going to be digested or broken down into their building blocks, which is going to be fatty acids and glycerol. Okay, so make sure you write those down. These concepts of biomolecules are not going away. Okay, so please make sure you remember that from last unit and can apply it to this digestion one. All right, but why is digestion needed? So once food is digested, it's small enough to diffuse, or what's the word I can use? Travel across the cell membranes of your small intestine cells into your blood. So remember, we've talked about the cell membrane. We talked about that, how that dictates what goes in and out of the cell. And some of those molecules that it lets in and out of the cell are going to be food, digested food particles that we need. So once food is digested, it's small enough to diffuse or travel through the cell membrane of our small intestine cells and into the blood. Once it gets into the blood, those food molecules are then going to be spread all around the body and diffuse across the cell membrane again. So again, when we say diffuse, we're talking about it's traveling across that cell membrane. Okay, so your blood carries the digested food all around your body. It diffuses across the cell membrane. And then finally, your cells can then be used, or wow, those, I really can't talk today, guys. Your cells can then use those molecules for growth, movement, and repairing cells. So once your body has digested those molecules, it can then reuse them for growth, movement, and repairing cells. All right. But we have to break those molecules down so they're small enough for our bodies to use them and for our cells to use them. So how does digestion work? Okay. So along the pathway through our body, our food is broken down into very small molecules by chewing and churning. These two examples, so chewing in the mouth and churning in the stomach, are both examples of mechanical digestion. Right? These are things that we are that are actively breaking down those food molecules. It's like manual labor. Okay, and by digestive juices or bile and enzymes, both of these things are examples of chemical digestion. Okay, so chewing happens in the mouth. It's when your teeth break down food. Churning happens in the stomach. It's when your stomach like actively churns and breaks down those food molecules. So both of those are chemical or mechanical digestion. And digestive juices or bile and enzymes, or like stomach acid, are going to be examples of chemical digestion, where chemical reactions are breaking down those molecules. Okay, so how does digestion work? Well, through a process of mechanical and chemical digestion. All right, so now I want you guys to think. We've talked about enzymes, now we're talking about digestion, but how do you think enzymes are involved in digestion? So go ahead and write down your guesses and then we'll go over it. So we know that enzymes speed up the rate of chemical reactions. Oh my. Okay, and remember that we had a fancy word for something that was talking about the sum of all chemical reactions. It started with an M. It's called metabolism, right? So how are enzymes involved in this? Well, they're directly involved in your metabolism. Okay, they're going to actively speed up the rate of those chemical reactions, which in turn speed up the rate of digestion. So enzymes are really in charge of chemical digestion. All right, so now there are 3 places where chemical digestion takes place, and each part of those, or each step of that, wow, I'm really struggling with my words today. Each step of chemical digestion is going to focus on breaking down specific organic molecules. So when we're talking about the mouth that has a pH of 7, let's see if I can draw a mouth. Oh yeah, that's cute. Okay, let's draw a little tongue. Let's give him some teeth. Oh, I'm feeling good about that. That's pretty cute. So you might have noticed that if you're ever really hungry and you start thinking about food, you actually might start salivating, right? Some spit might start shooting out of the sides of your mouth, which sounds really gross. But that saliva is actually full of an enzyme called amylase. Okay, and amylase's job, remember it ends in ASE, so we know that's an enzyme, is to break down starch. So that's why if you stick a cracker in your mouth, it's going to just naturally dissolve over time. You don't have to chew it because that amylase is already breaking down the starch in your mouth before you even start chewing. All right, the stomach, let's see if I can draw a stomach. Oh yeah, oh. Sound like the Kool-Aid man. The stomach is going to, which has a pH of 3, which is super acidic, remember, is going to focus on breaking down protein. Okay, so whenever you think of the stomach, you can think of a nice like T-bone steak in here. Let's see if I can draw a steak. That's pretty nice. We'll draw some red on there to show it's meat. Okay, so your stomach is going to specialize in breaking down protein. And finally, your small intestine, which has a pH of 8, which is pretty basic. Okay, it's slightly above neutral, but because it has an 8, it is a little bit basic, is going to focus on breaking down fats and then complete the digestion of any starch and protein that hasn't been fully digested. So here's your small intestine. Okay, and when you think of this, I want you to think of like a stick of butter sliding through it, because that's what specializes in breaking down fats. Okay, so mouth breaks down starch, stomach breaks down protein, small intestine breaks down fats, and then finishes digesting the starch and protein. Now, there are 4 stages of food processing that we need to know. The first one is known as ingestion. Now, ingest is just another word for eat. So when we talk about ingesting something, that's us eating food or drinking. That is us actively eating food. So ingestion happens in your mouth. That's when you just put the food in your mouth. Eating is ingesting. The second stage is going to be digestion. That's when we're actively breaking down that food into smaller pieces through mechanical digestion or smaller molecules with chemical digestion. So that is where we're breaking down the food. Right? The third step is absorption. This is when we uptake those small nutrient molecules into the body. So when we're talking about absorption, we're talking about soaking up those nutrients. Okay. Once your body has taken up all the nutrients that it needs, the final step, maybe your favorite, is elimination. And elimination is when we get rid of all of those undigested wastes from the body. Use your imagination to figure out what that looks like. But this is when we're going to get rid of wastes. All right, so if you think about this, it really makes sense, right? The first stage of food processing is you have to eat. The second step is your body has to break down that food. Once the food has been broken down, your body is going to absorb those nutrients. And finally, whatever is left over that your body doesn't need, we're going to get rid of. Right? So those are the 4 stages of food processing. Now, the last thing I want you guys to do today, you're actually going to do on your own. So I want you to complete part B independently. You guys are going to follow the pathway of digestion using the diagram to guide your response, describing how you think each component of the digestive system is involved in the process of eating, digesting, and excreting food and wastes. Write your response in 3 or more sentences below. So when you write this, I want you to basically explain, using what you've learned so far, how does the digestive system work? And how are these things involved in it? Now, you won't be able to use all of them, but I want you to include as many of these organs as you can when you're describing how does this pathway of digestion work. Okay, so 3 or more sentences below. How are these organs involved in digestion? All right, and I will be checking your responses, so make sure that they're up to par, okay? Other than that, that's all I've got for you today. Make sure you complete that exit ticket. Make sure you fill in these notes, specifically part B, which you're doing independently. And other than that, have a wonderful day, and I will see you guys tomorrow.